This episode is made possible by our generous patrons.
Welcome to episode 139 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book
And then see the movie.
I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week we discuss Philip K. Dick's 1966 short story, We Will Remember It For You, Wholesale, and its 1990 adaptation, Total Recall. Alright, man, this movie was a fucking trip. It was out there, it was wild, it was buck wild. I don't know, there's so many adjectives to throw at it. The story was something else too. I'm excited to get into this one and sort of get back into our coverage of books and movies.
It feels like, in some ways, like the height of excess, right? It's like the ultimate 80s, 90s transitioning period. Like, CG wasn't super heavily involved in this movie, only a little tiny bit. And we have, like, insane practical effects. We have Arnold at the height of his powers, being Arnold, action movie star, firing machine guns. And then there's still some social commentary in this movie that I think is notable. I think within this big movie that I think people responded to well at the time. It earned its R rating. There was sex, violence, blood, gore, guts. I think it's still there's still something in it that I think makes it memorable to this day.
Absolutely. And height of excess is a great way to describe it. I had a note where I was like, man, every time this movie can possibly go above a 10, it goes above a 10. It like breaks the fucking meter off, you know what I mean? Like it just turns it up to a 13. It's wild. Like it's just so over the top and wild. Like I don't know how to describe it, but before we started recording, I was a little bit congested and I was like, I got to go, take some nasal spray and clear up the sinuses. And I think injecting a stimulant into my nose is probably the perfect metaphor for this movie.
Do you feel like you're reaching up to pull your tracker out of your face?
Yeah, or doing something else in the 80s with a mirror and a razor blade.
Yeah.
It was wild. But before we get into it, I mean, it's a lot of fun, and we're gonna have some fun talking about it. And like you said, there's definitely some important stuff going on in there. We did want to sort of address the ongoing situation in America. We released a statement last week where we talked about how we support Black Lives Matter. We believe that Black Lives Matter and that we support the protests that are ongoing. This is, a movement, not a moment. And we want to express our continued support for it, even while we do sort of get back into the podcast routine that we had going before.
Right. And, we aren't the best voices to be listening to on the subject right now. We think clearly there are great resources out there. I urge anyone to seek out these resources, and let's all continue to grow and learn from this and, create a better community for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, growing and learning, I think, is something that I have really tried to do, because this situation is one where I sort of looked at myself and continue to identify unconscious biases. I think that's something that all of us have across the spectrum. Whatever experience you live, having bias is part of being human. And I think learning to recognize them and, resist them when they're affecting you, and also recognize the effect of majority bias. Like if a majority of people have a certain bias, how that's going to affect a system in a way that will be oppressive, right? Like a shared bias always gets written into policy. Like is I think a way that to think about it. And I don't know, it's just something that I'm still getting into, and I'm still learning more about it, and I'm still thinking more about it, and I want to continue to do that, and I want to internalize it, and I want it to become an ongoing part of the way that we look at books and movies on this podcast.
Yeah. I mean, that, like you saying internalize, really that really encompasses exactly what I want to do with this at this moment in time, is really internalize everything that I'm hearing and try to change my perspective to the point that I feel like I'm doing all I can for people with my privilege and in the situation I am, and just acknowledging, like you said, maybe some biases. So yeah, we just wanted to take that moment to make sure that we're going to continue to show support on the podcast. And you know, if we see something in a story, we're going to call bullshit on it. And, you know, we've tried to do that to this point, and we're going to continue to do that.
Absolutely. And, you know, sometimes, you know, as someone who's trying to write right now, it can feel like art is in some ways frivolous, and it can feel unimportant. But I think it's important to remember that it's the opposite of that. Like, in many ways, you know, whether it's a book or a movie or what have you, something else, art is so important. And it is important in the time it's written and important in the time it's made, but also important later because it can become sort of an artifact of a time. I think we often try and look at stuff from the perspective of the creators who were behind it, the creatives who created it. But there is also something to be said for pieces being a byproduct of culture and being a byproduct of the time they were created in. And so looking back at pieces, you know, like a movie like this or a short story like this, it does show me something about what people were thinking about in this time and what people thought was entertaining or thought was you know, okay to say, you know what I mean? Like there's so much you can look at.
Yeah, like things that people thought were progressive or forward thinking, and you're like, you know, that you could see them taking that step, but maybe it wasn't far enough, you know, in hindsight.
Right. Yeah. So we're going to continue to look at things from that perspective, right? But once again, we're two white dudes, and we totally recognize that. So I actually want to shout out another podcast that I'll recommend. It's called Black Chick Lit. Great podcast, and you should check them out if you want to hear about books from a Black woman perspective, which I think is very valuable right now. So I'll put a link to their show in the show notes. Go check them out.
All right, so transitioning into our coverage here, we first read the short story, We Will Remember It For You Wholesale. What is it?
Yes, We Will Remember It For You Wholesale. Yeah. Philip K. Dick's naming conventions continue to be pretty amazing. He loves these like sentences, like "Do androids dream of electric sheep?" Right? You know.
It was funny because like when I just said that, I thought that I said it correctly, but there was like a word or two in there that I thought I misplaced. But yeah, We Will Remember It For You Wholesale.
Yeah, right. Which I want to go ahead and place with the other Philip K. Dick stuff we've done. So we covered the Minority Report, which was a short story that was adapted into Minority Report. That was written in 1956. This short story came out in 1966. So this is 10 years into his career, you know, further into his career, and 2 years prior to Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. Maybe he had started writing it at this point. I don't know, but it definitely wasn't out yet. So just situating it like where we are in the Philip K. Dick spectrum. I know there's lots of other adaptations. I'm sure this is an author we're going to return to. We've touched on his personal life in some of our other coverage. I think some of the important things to know is that he had many wives, and we've constantly found sort of a through line of sexism in a lot of the stuff we've read from him. That is also coupled with these like big sci-fi ideas. Mm-hmm. And I think that was on full display here. I don't think there was anything different to that so far in this short story.
Something I'm realizing from his writing, too, is just how he has these massive concepts and then always leaves the reader wanting more. And it's so nice to have filmmakers take that and then create like a full world around it. Because he'll place you in a moment in time and tell you sort of the technology around it or like the sci-fi elements. And then, you know, put you through some of the steps. And then it seems like for the most part, the filmmakers that have adapted a lot of his stuff have taken it and run with it and kind of made it their own. But yeah, in this case, it was one of those ones where we get a few scenes that do show up somewhat in the movie, but really it's sort of the skeleton of what the movie would become.
Right, like you said, it's a great point. It's like a jumping off point. And when I read the story, I was like, oh yeah, I could see reading this and going, I want to make a massive action movie starring Arnold Schwarzenegger out of this story. Right. And when you decide you're going to do that, there's so much you can do with this concept as sort of the base for it. But let's save the movie, I think, now, and let's focus on the story. It's actually a pretty simplified version of it, right? Like we talked about, Quail is this, like, I don't think he's a minor in the story, but he is this, like, everyman who's bored of his life, and he's having dreams about Mars, and he has a wife that, in true Philip K. Dick fashion, is terrible. He has this awful relationship with her. She's sort of mean and judgmental, and he always is talking about her face and how, like, she scrunches it up, and it's, like, giving him nasty looks all the time. And then he also has like moments of paranoia about her, of course, that just grow throughout, which having just a little bit of Philip K. Dick we've read, I'm like not surprised at all with this wife character. And then he goes to this Total Recall place because he wants to have this memory of Mars. He's like pining for, like, he wishes he could travel there, but he can't afford it. And then he gets an implanted memory. Something goes wrong. He leaves with like bits of the memory, and then he goes back to demand his money. And then they say they never implanted the memory, and actually he does have this memory because he really did go to Mars, and he really is a secret agent. And then some secret agents come to his house, and he has to escape from them. They're tracking him in his mind, and then they bring him in finally at the end, and he gets another memory implanted that's based off of this fantasy he had as a child, because he wants to he negotiates with them to not have them kill him, and he says, well, if I can just believe this fantasy, it'll be harmless and it won't bother anyone, but it'll be big enough that I won't seek out this Mars memory. And so he bases it off this fantasy he had as a child, where these like these small aliens came to Earth and threatened to destroy it unless he like kept their secret or something. Like, I forget what it was. It was like, I
think it had something to do with they grew to like him so much that they said they wouldn't destroy the Earth as long as he lived.
Right. Yeah, that's right. He surprised them with how good of a guy he was, I guess. And anyway, so he says, well, let's just make that the memory. They implant that into his head, and then lo and behold, it's already there. Once again, this really happened, and they realize they can't kill him because then these aliens would come and destroy the Earth. And so both of these situations are about them trying to implant a memory that ends up actually being true, which I also think is kind of interesting to remember going forward with the movie. But this is the story, and I don't know, how did it stack up to you? Oh, before we get into it, actually, before you answer, I realized watching Total Recall that I had never seen that movie.
Wow.
I was aware of it. I had seen certain scenes referenced and like all kinds of stuff.
Sure, somebody had at least at some point in your adolescence talked to you about a 3-boobed woman, right?
Oh, absolutely. I knew that was coming, you know what I mean? Like, there's lots of stuff I was aware of, but I had never actually seen the movie. And so I didn't have a lot of preconceived notions. What's funny, though, I did see the 2012 remake.
Oh, man. I haven't seen that.
Okay, so I have seen that, and like, I barely remember that movie. Speaking of Total Recall, I barely remember the movie. I found it forgettable. So I don't know. I actually kind of want to watch it again now that I have seen this. Anyway, I'm getting off the rails, but my whole point being that I didn't have a lot of preconceived notions going into reading this. I really didn't know what to expect, but you had seen the movie. So I'm curious what this story read like for you.
I think I brought, as I sometimes do when I've seen the movie first, some of the baggage of the movie, and I felt like the main thing I walked away with is thinking about how it seems like sort of, and it's especially is in the movie, but even in the book, in the story here, it seems like wish fulfillment, right? It just seems like I am the most important person in the world, that if I die, the world will end, and like sort of being a savior just by existing. But I mean, knowing that sort of some of the stuff was coming, the alien stuff, I had no idea that was coming. The sort of aliens being on the table, I understood that, but aliens who came down and basically liked him so much that they wouldn't destroy the Earth, not expecting that. And it's very different from sort of the way that aliens play a part in the movie. All in all, though, this idea of, as with many Philip K. Dick ideas, the idea of someone has something planted in their memory, just the idea of going on a trip to Mars as being like an implanted memory. I think that's an amazing idea. And then you take that and then you have a character who's already has that memory, and all the twists and turns that come from that. Having it be about a secret agent just always is going to remind me of like a Bond or like a sort of a Jason Bourne type thing. So knowing that he's like a secret agent that had memories that were wiped away, things like that, things that he doesn't remember, kind of made me think of that.
And I want to situate this where it's at in time, right? This is written in the 60s. So these ideas, like, I can see how this was amazing, and I want to mention this story was first published in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, which is a magazine that is still ongoing today and has this storied history. And it's amazing to me to think about how big these ideas were for the time. And I think that's what, that's what sold people on it. You know what I mean? It's like, wow, this is something notable. He had already, built himself a little bit of a reputation by this point, but he wasn't, Philip K. Dick we know today. You know what I mean? I don't think he had cemented his legacy. So I don't know. It's a fascinating story. And, a lot of my problems with Philip K. Dick are on display. I didn't feel like the characters were particularly deep or well-rounded, but the idea of fucking with your memory and how that affects story is endlessly fascinating to me, right? Like our memory is so closely tied to our identities. And I think that is something that he's touching on here. Like, he wants to have an identity of someone who is important. And so he's willing to pay to have that artificially given to him. But through the act of paying to have it artificially given to him, it is instead revealed to have always been the case. So I think you're right on with that, like, how important it is about it being sort of a power fantasy, because at the end of it, the way you're left feeling is like, ooh, what if all of us had a secret history that were actually super important? You know what I mean? Like, that could be true, and it sort of it gives you that power fantasy moment at the end, I guess.
This idea of anything that your mind can or can't remember, it's reminiscent of something like Memento, which we really enjoyed on the podcast here. In the way that, like, if I'm having something that the main character can't remember, and how that would affect it in effect forms the person that you are. What your memories are forms who you are, and I think we see some of that in the movie here as well, where we see seemingly he was a kind of a garbage person, and then changing his memories and everything like that fully changed him into the person that we see as the hero at the end of the story. And we can debate on whether everything was implanted. All of those little screens that they had that they were showing of the corporation maybe manipulating that kind of stuff. We'll talk about that when we get to the movie. But this idea of, like, memory shaping the person that you are, and how, like, changing one thing could drastically change your personality or your ideals on the way you think about things.
Yeah, and I kept thinking of another movie that memory is really important. It is Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind.
Yeah.
Right. That movie's more about forgetting, but I think it's still getting into that same concept of, like, memory and how tied it is to identity, and putting in a memory that isn't real, isn't authentic, and what that would do to somebody. And it's funny because this idea is so big that I'm like, of course there's been 25 other movies made about this.
Yeah.
Because this story barely scratches the surface of what this could mean. But I'm not a historian when it comes to science fiction, but I assume this is one of the earliest examples of this sort of thing, in this fashion. So, it's just fascinating to see the sort of legacy that this idea has had.
Right. And I think that's a lot of what people love about Philip K. Dick, is sort of the legacy that he left, and the ideas that sort of people have taken and run with, made their own versions of, or just were inspired by.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and just to touch on the sexism again, there's only 2 women characters in this short story. One of them is a receptionist who always has her breasts bared whenever he sees her. Mm-hmm. And then the other one is his wife, who is pretty much terrible, is actually against him. I think she is connected with the agents. Oh, no, sorry, that's the movie. She divorces him in the story. He starts having this, like, paranoia, and he starts talking to her about how he was actually an agent, and she just divorces him and leaves. This is such Philip K. Dick classic woman characters. So be prepared if you do go into the story that is going to be in there.
Yeah, so ultimately, I think a good jumping off point, as we've said, and I think that's what many people saw with this story. It passed through many hands. At one point, David Cronenberg was attached for actually a pretty large period of time. And some of the concepts remained, from what I read. I think Kawato is a holdover from sort of Cronenberg's part of it, and I think a lot of the body horror that you see in this movie sort of, was a holdover from maybe Cronenberg. But the person who ultimately directed this film's name is Paul Verhoeven. He's a Dutch director, screenwriter, and film producer, active in both the Netherlands and Hollywood. Verhoeven's blending of graphic violence and sexual content with social satire are trademarks of both his drama and science fiction films.
Wait. I have to ask. Is he connected to RoboCop?
He is connected to RoboCop.
Okay, I didn't know that. I just recognize the style.
Yep. Okay, so there's going to be a couple of things that are pretty massive here for Paul Verhoeven. Maybe another piece falling into place for you. So he found success growing up in the Netherlands, and had many movies come out there. and then eventually made the transition to America. And his first American directed film was RoboCop. So other than RoboCop, which came out in 1987, other famous films that I think you might be familiar with are Total Recall, which we just watched, 1990, Basic Instinct in 1992, Showgirls in 1995, Starship Troopers in 1997, and Hollow Man in 2000.
That's so funny, man, that Starship Troopers, I was just thinking about that movie the other day and how over the top, and I was like, oh man, this reminds me a little bit of Starship Troopers. It's over the top sci-fi that's super violent and has this like social satire going on, and I had no idea it was the same director. That's funny.
Right. Well, I mean, RoboCop as well. I think you can look at RoboCop as like this sort of, I don't know, it's kind of a landmark film. It dealt with, it has this way over the top 80s action. And then in there is this social commentary about, fascism basically, or totalitarianism, and sort of just this idea of overbearing government.
Yeah, isn't it like, it's been a long time since I've seen the movie, but isn't it about like corruption in the police and stuff?
Yes.
Yeah, so like I would be fascinated to watch that movie again in light of, recent events. I'm sure it's not perfect or anything, but yeah, I had almost forgotten that. Like it feels like it's this, when people remember it as like a pro cop movie, but it's really all about corruption, right?
Exactly. And I think that you can see that in all three of the major films that we're talking about here, RoboCop, Total Recall, and Starship Troopers, where we see RoboCop as sort of like you're saying, there's corruption in the police department and some corruption in the government. And then here in Total Recall, we're seeing corruption in corporations, basically dictating how people live their lives. And then we see in Starship Troopers, we see the military and the military industrial system and just how, these things can be corrupt. Sort of, and in a really interesting satirical way, I think a lot of people watch RoboCop or Total Recall and Starship Troopers, and they, I don't know that they necessarily pick up on everything that's being said there. It's a because I think on the surface you could see it as this over the top action 80s film with sex and violence and blood and gore and all this, but I think he's very carefully threading in some major themes that he wants the audience to think about. Something that I found in my research about Paul Verhoeven was, as a small child, he had lived through the Nazi occupation, and the experience shaped him, not only in films that would address the war directly, like Soldier of Orange and Black Book, but in genre entertainments that smuggled themes about life under fascism.
I could see it, and it that ties into kind of my thoughts on this movie. I don't know if we want to get into sort of general thoughts yet, or if you have more history you want to hit me with.
Yeah, I mean, I'll have other stuff throughout, but let's get into general thoughts.
Yeah, so, I had never seen this movie. I had seen the remake, which I have forgotten, and I'll have to have like a Total Recall, situation to even remember it, apparently. I know Colin Farrell's in it. That's about all I remember. Yeah,
and it's a potential bonus episode at some point for our patrons.
Oh, absolutely. Like, we're going to cover it as a bonus. Maybe even this month. We'll see. But yeah, this movie, man, like, I was conflicted about it, but like, ultimately I had a lot of fun watching it, and like, I at the end I remember thinking, like, was this movie actually pretty good? Like, it's a pretty good movie. And it's bonkers though. Like, it is over the top wild in every situation it could possibly have. Right. Yet it's still pretty good.
And like, there clearly is some misogyny in here, and maybe some prejudice and racism.
Well, and like the Benny character, I thought was an interesting example of that, where at first I was ready to say, like, it's completely racist, right? Like, he's a taxi cab driver. He's just there to help the main character, the white character, and all this stuff. And that is still true, yet he then inverts it by having him turn on him. And actually, that caught me off guard. I didn't expect Benny to turn on him. Right. And becomes a villain. And, it's still a problem because there's just not enough black characters in this movie to where, like, a lot is placed on this one character. I think there's only, like, one other, and this, like, the secretary, right, in the entire movie.
And he ultimately becomes a villain. But there are a couple of lines that are said as well. Like, at one point, he tells him to, like, use the money to go take his kids to the dentist or something like that. Like, that struck me as, like,
his teeth, yeah. And then there's the whole uncomfortable situation when he puts the towel on his head, and then he does that little bow where I think he's trying to, evoke like being a Sikh or something. I'm not really sure, but
I'm not sure.
Yeah, something. But it wasn't great. But, you know, with the Benny thing, like, it does feel like he was trying to say something else with it. Like, he's like, oh, I'm going to have this character that you think is going to fit into a certain mold, this racist mold, and then I'm going to do something surprising with it. Now, like you said, like, he doesn't go far enough, and there's not enough other representation, so I don't want to, like, praise this guy too much for what he did, but it's something, you know what I mean? Like,
I mean, the character has more agency than just helping the character
Exactly.
along his journey and all that. Like, there's something meaty there in the role for someone to dig into, you know? Like, that's a character that people would love to play.
well, it's dynamic, right? Like, he's got a hidden agenda. He's gonna have a turn. He's not just a sacrificial lamb like so many of these characters are in other films. So, but anyway, back to my point about the movie. Like, surprisingly good. Starts off with eyeballs and a face like swelling up that's going to become apparently super important throughout the rest of the movie. This movie loves its decompression scenes.
Oh, yeah.
And what it theoretically does to the body, which it doesn't do. Not like that. But, you know, it's so over the top. You called it cartoonish earlier on, and I think that's a good word for it.
And, you know, we talked about with the short story, this sort of idea of wish fulfillment. This is the ultimate, like,
Yes.
80s wish fulfillment movie because there's, like, multiple women are after him. You know, he's the biggest, strongest person ever. He's a secret agent on the run. He can fight and kill anyone in any way.
Any Arnold movie is sort of a white dude wish fulfillment movie at its base, right? Because he's this, like, Adonis, right? Like, everyone's supposed to want to be as far as physicality.
Yeah, and I mean, I think maybe there was something being done here with sort of flipping that on its head in maybe some sort of satirical way, because I think this movie is kind of poking fun at the action genre in certain ways, while also doing all of the tropes and doing all of the things, all the fight scenes.
Well, and yeah, you mentioned that you felt like it was kind of the quintessential 80s movie, and I had that same note written down. Like, it really was. It felt like it was trying to, like, be a culmination of all of the stuff that had been building throughout the 80s. And then it got self-aware a little bit, and it kind of knew what it was doing, and I feel like that kind of broke it a little bit too. Like, sometimes it can happen when you get self-aware,
right?
In a weird way, to where, like, you know, what followed had to sort of change it. Like, it couldn't be the same kind of movie as this. This particular brand of movie had sort of been done to, you know, 13 out of 10 on everything you could possibly do. So now we got to do something different,
right? Just to address a couple of things as far as the production went, the writer Dan O'Bannon had a falling out with the director Paul Verhoeven, where Verhoeven replaced the satirical humor with extreme violence. And the original screenplay, dark humor was much more prevalent. But when Arnold Schwarzenegger came aboard, Verhoeven recognized the necessity to tailor the script to Schwarzenegger's talents. So I guess the writer felt that there was, like, things needed to be more funny, and then Verhoeven took it and said, we're making an Arnold movie, let's make it satirical in the way of violence.
Yeah, I'm curious what that dark humor would have looked like. You know, I'm sure there's still a good bit of it in the movie, but I thought, like, the violence, I guess it did feel a little weird, but I quickly acclimated to it, and it was like, okay, this is sort of satirical of action movies, right? Like, he's going to get in a fight with people, and he's going to, like, there's going to be a little sharp thing that he rips off, and then he's just going to stab it through someone's head, and then, like, he's going to punch someone in the face, and you're going to hear their neck crack, and, like, everything was so bloody, and over, you know, he gets in a gunfight at one point on an escalator, and the person in front of him is just a random person, starts getting shot, so he just uses that as, like, a meat shield for the rest of the fight, and he gets shot, like, a million times, and then he throws the corpse at the bad guys and runs away. Like,
apparently that scene had pushed. They had to do some recutting in the edit, because originally the cut of this film that came out was an X rating. So apparently, because of this specific scene, they had to recut it in certain ways so that they could get it down to an R rating, because it was just so absolutely excessive in every way. I do want to, like, this is, I think, a great time to shout out the special effects.
Oh wait, before I had a question.
Sure.
These special effects look familiar to me. It looked like, maybe I'm wrong, but does this have any connection to The Thing? Because I was thinking of The Thing.
Yes, it does, in fact, have strong connections to The Thing. Yeah. So Rob Bottin is an American special effects creator, known for his collaborations with directors John Carpenter, Paul Verhoeven, and David Fincher. Bottin worked with Carpenter on both The Fog and The Thing, with Verhoeven on RoboCop, Total Recall, Basic Instinct, and with Fincher on Seven and Fight Club. His other film credits include Legend, Inner Space, and Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
Is Basic Instinct the famous like Sharon Stone movie who was
Yes.
also in this movie?
Yes.
Okay, I need to see that apparently because I've seen it referenced a million times, but I've never actually watched the whole movie. And it's weird to think that it's this director and this special effects crew. Like, what is that movie about?
Right.
I thought it was about lawyers or something. Like, I have no idea clearly what that movie's about.
I think it's definitely. I don't know if is it based on a book. I'm not sure if it is, but
I'm not sure. We should look into it.
It'd be cool to cover that at some point because I think if RoboCop was based on a book, we would absolutely be covering it.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think at some point we have plans to cover Starship Troopers.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Yeah, that would be a really fascinating one to cover.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're going to see a lot of Rob Bottin. We vehemently have already said that we love him and his special effects. We spoke with Mike Arnzen on our Thing episodes and spoke a lot about the special effects and what it meant to that film and what it brings to sort of the terror of that film. I think Rob Bottin in this absolutely over the top, batshit crazy movie took those special effects and brought them into this, brought legitimacy to scenes. And these special effects were absolutely amazing in this movie. Even like you're saying, the eyes popping out of the face, like any of the creatures or anything. There's the scene of there's the scene where he's dressed as a larger woman, and then the like disguise comes off of his head, and it's clearly all prosthetics and everything, and then he throws the helmet. All of that stuff looks basically photorealistic. All of it looks completely real. And I just can't say enough amazing things about this guy. He is responsible for some of my favorite special effects in movies.
Yeah, Arnold has this especially this time period, he kind of doesn't look like a real person. And so I think that lends itself to when you're making like forms of his head, like he's got such sort of distinctive features that because clearly like they've made several models of his head that they do different things to different times in the movie. A
lot of times it's just like open mouth, like a really like strained face, open mouth thing.
Yeah, I kept expecting it to sprout spider legs and go walking off the table because it looked identical to that scene.
Right.
The effects were wild. Moratorium on over the top. We're not saying it anymore, and I'm gonna hold you to that too because I heard you say it a minute ago. We got to find other descriptors. But in this movie, the way that it works is that turn at the end where there's sort of an open question of like, was this all a dream? And in that sense, the cartoonishness of it all is explained away, right? Like it's sort of lampshaded. Like maybe that's why everything was so unrealistic and bizarre.
Right. I mean, I have a couple things to respond to what you just said. The first I wanted to just talk about Paul Verhoeven and special effects supervisor Rob Bottin had constant disagreements during the making of RoboCop, so it seemed unlikely that they would ever work together again. However, when they saw how good RoboCop had turned out, they changed their minds and Verhoeven gave Bottin full freedom to make his own Martian creature designs for Total Recall. Which, I mean, seeing the creatures, seeing the mutants in this film and seeing the Martians, that is my favorite part of the movie. Like everything in the underbelly sort of, and it's reminiscent of a Blade Runner. We have our people who are down in the slums having to live like that because of corporations and because of, other people doing well. Just to draw that connection, it's got to be there. Blade Runner coming out before this, it has to have influenced it in some way.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I guess I see the connection there, but it felt so different because it was so bright. Like this movie is a very bright movie, whereas Blade Runner is not.
Yeah,
to fit the style, maybe the style is just way different. We gotta say something about this thunder, man. At some point, people are gonna hear some thunder on your track because there is a crazy storm going on where you're at.
Yeah, if you hear that thunder, I'm sorry. I'm gonna do what I can to pull it out, but it's probably gonna end up in there some. So you were speaking about Blade Runner. I was speaking about the similarities. Just to double back to that, Dan O'Bannon, the person who had disagreements with Paul Verhoeven on this film, Dan O'Bannon and Ronald Shusett previously worked together on Alien in 1979, directed by Ridley Scott.
Wow, love that movie.
And then Scott went on to direct Blade Runner in 1982, which was also based off of Philip K. Dick's story. Mm-hmm. And then apparently that film was inspiration for RoboCop. So, Blade Runner was inspiration for RoboCop, which Paul Verhoeven there has a connection as well. And then, that all leads here to Total Recall.
That's totally in the DNA. I can say, I mean, that's a direct line, so I feel you. One thing I kept thinking of was, did you ever play the video games Red Faction?
I played one of them.
Came out in I think the early 2000s. I want to say they came out. There was a few of them.
I think I played like the newest one that came out. It was like like 2007 or 6 or something when I played that one. And that was like the Martians. Like
I'm thinking of like the first 1 and 2. Like it was like Red Faction 1, Red Faction 2. I think are the ones that I'm most remembering. This was during the time of like Half-Life, like early Halo. Some of these were the games that were coming out. And anyway, it was about being, I think, a miner on Mars, and then like a rebellion happens. And when I was watching this movie, I kept thinking like this had to have been the primary inspiration for Red Faction. Because the look of everything, like the red rock everywhere, the digging machines, the fighting back, and the sort of rebellion of it all, like, unless I'm misremembering, like, I think that's all there in Red Faction. So I feel like this had to be the primary inspiration. So it's just funny how these ideas just go and go and go and go, right? All from this Philip K. Dick story.
Yeah, I mean, I from the one that I played, I felt the exact same way. It was, it's just that reddish tint that you see in every Martian film, but it's like the fact that this is, I guess, the comparison to Blade Runner, this isn't a film noir, like Blade Runner is a film noir. Yeah. I think this is like a bright, during the day, I don't know if you could call it cyberpunk, but it's got that underbelly.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it cyberpunk, really.
Where, we meet colorful characters, we meet...
For sure.
There's the sort of overbearing social system and the corporations, everything like that. I just think there are a lot of similarities there.
Absolutely, man. That reminds me, I wanted to shout out this movie for going for it. I think anytime I see a movie that is trying to predict the future and just goes in 100%, like we're going to have all this bizarre, tech, and like some of it ended up being kind of close and some of it ended up being completely wrong. And like that, it's just fun to look back at these time capsules of like what people imagined the future to be like.
Yeah, and we don't know if it's right yet. We still have like another 60 years to find out.
I missed the year. Is that what it is? It's like 2080?
Yeah, I think it's like 2080 something.
Okay. Yeah, so maybe there's still time where we'll have these giant pillars of phones that just to have the video chat.
Right.
Yeah, it's funny. How about those scanners, man? I actually really enjoyed those. The skeletons walking through, and I shout out to them for including a blind person with a dog. I'm sure they just included it because they wanted to show a dog skeleton because they thought that would be interesting. But it is actually nice to see disabled people in the future. I know that's like been a big thing that people have talked about. Is like not erasing all disabled people from your sci-fi. So I don't know. I noted that.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that as well. The X-ray moment, all of that there was early on when I was talking about CG. That's the moment I was actually talking about. This was one of the last major Hollywood blockbusters to make large scale use of miniature effects as opposed to CGI. And we've talked a lot about how we saw the transition in The Lord of the Rings with Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings, and I think that was the very end of it. But this is like a turning point. This was one of the first. Although it was one of the last major blockbusters to use the large scale, it was also one of the first major Hollywood blockbusters to use CG, mainly for the scenes involving the X-ray scanner, in order to have it look photoreal. So from what I understand from my research, the CG that they were going to use, there were sort of like motion capture programs they were going to use to just animate something that's moving in a similar way that a human body was. But apparently the software wasn't working correctly, so they had to actually go in and hand animate. Everything was like animated in a computer still, I believe, but it was fully animated from the motion capture performances of people walking and everything like that. And just the use of technology of the time in 1990, the moment where the alarm goes off and you can see the gun and the scanner and he jumps through, that's a fun moment.
It looked cool.
It really works.
I mean, yeah, I could tell it was them enjoying this technology and this VFX scenario that they had set up. And sure, it looks a little dated, but it was still fun. Oh, speaking of, there is this "Get Your Ass to Mars" is like a statement that I've seen on T-shirts, and I didn't realize it was a reference to this movie, but it sure is.
Isn't that great?
Yeah, I love it.
Get Your Ass to Mars. Yeah, apparently that line wasn't necessarily in the script, and it was sort of an added thing at the end, because I think they shot the footage that you're looking at on the screen of Arnold. I think that was shot like later, and I think it was sort of like an ad lib situation or something like that from what I was reading. So the "Get Your Ass to Mars" and specifically Arnold Schwarzenegger saying "Get your ass to Mars" in that way repeatedly on this like broken monitor as like, you know, rats are shot, their blood's all over the screen and everything. It's iconic, and like you said, it's been used in a different way now. That's, you know, a really positive thing. You know, get your ass to Mars. Let's continue space exploration.
Yeah, it's a call to action for people. Like we gotta get as humanity, we gotta get to Mars. So yeah, I think it's cool, and I had no idea that it comes back to this moment. And that I was talking earlier about like how important art can be. Like just that alone is like a little example of this statement from this sort of campy, if I could call it that, movie, 90s action movie, early 90s, late 80s action movie. And yet it became a call to action for many people in the scientific community that they sort of like adopted. I don't know, it's cool.
So I mean, I think it's great. Sci-fi has always been important to STEM. You know, it's always been important to science and technology, engineering, mathematics. It's always been important to those things. And people will watch Star Wars, something like that, and just see, you know, space travel, see all of these things and be inspired for the rest of their lives to work towards these real world, you know, applications in ways that further the future.
I was just talking about movies that go for it, right? Like, in some ways, it's funny how that feeds into things, right? Like people get inspired by, you know, Star Trek and being able to have video communications, and or certain things, you know, and inventors try and invent stuff based off of ideas they saw in a sci-fi. So in that way, like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy sometimes. Like you could put it out there as like maybe technology could do this one day, and that's something people who are writing sci-fi today think about is like when you're proposing new tech that is just out there and like maybe it's not even based off anything, but like wouldn't it be cool if tech could do this? Someone could read that or see it and think like, actually, maybe there's a way it could do that, and you could inspire someone to actually create it. And it's wild to think that it can have that effect, right?
I mean, yeah, life imitating art, right? And it's so interesting to think about. You know, some of the greatest minds of our times are potentially, you know, being inspired by fiction and then making it a reality.
Right. Well, and it's trippy to think about, and I want to talk a little bit about something else that's trippy, and that is there's a scene later on we get where the main spokesman from Total Recall shows up to Quaid's hotel room and tries to completely mindfuck him and tell him that this is all a dream and this is all just him back in the chair at Total Recall. And then his wife shows up with him and tries to talk him out, and she's in on it. And maybe it still all is, I don't know. But that scene was really fun, and I liked how it turned everything on its head a little bit, which then sets up the moment at the end in a way that I think works really well, where it's not just a completely out of nowhere, like, hey, maybe this is all a dream, haha. It was like, yeah, that actually was hinted at earlier in the film. So you're kind of prepared for it in a way. So where I actually think it works better than some of the like M. Night Shyamalan pull the rug out from under you moments that we can sometimes get.
There's multiple moments where it could start to become a dream for the character, right? Even there at the end, like did he actually rip his arm out of the restraint and stab it into the guy's throat and then continue? Like from that moment, is it a dream on? You know what I mean? Is the ending the dream? Is all of it a dream? I do have the statements on where Verhoeven and Arnie land on it, I believe.
Interesting.
But
okay,
think
before you
get
read
to that
those,
at the end.
yeah, maybe we should think about it. Like, I guess you've already read them, so maybe I don't know if that affects you at all. But if you can remember, for me, like I don't know, there is no. See, like I guess I can see the code a little bit too much. You know what I mean? I can see the hands of the creators on it too much, to where it's hard for me to step back and say, oh, I think this is what happened, because like there is no objective truth. It's all about interpretation.
It's about it's about being ambiguous.
Yeah. So what do I find interesting? I find this whole wild ride to be interesting as something that probably happened with a tinge of maybe it didn't. And so I guess I like that. I like leaning towards it probably happened in the the truth of the fiction, with the chance that maybe it didn't. I guess I just am fundamentally slightly less interested in this all being a dream, but I like the idea of it maybe being one. So that's where I'm at, which sounds non-committal, but that's just the truth of it.
I mean, it's the same sort of thing as like at the end of the thing, like is one of the characters actually a thing? Are they both humans? Leaving it up to the audience interpretation just always leads for more conversation. And I think a lot of times people appreciate it if it's done well. Now, do you want to know where Verhoeven and Schwarzenegger land on
Let's
it?
hear it.
Okay, so Verhoeven wanted to make the movie completely ambiguous so audiences would not know, even at the end, whether it was all just a dream. Verhoeven himself said he believed the ending was a dream, but at the same time, he also said that the casting of Arnold Schwarzenegger suggests it is not a dream, as most audiences who go to see a Schwarzenegger would be in favor of a reality ending as opposed to a dream ending.
So he's using like meta reasons to that's like another level, right?
Well,
like,
I mean, that brings it back to sort of what I think he's able to accomplish with this movie. I was reading someone wrote this about sort of the over-sexualism and the violence that's in this movie, and how he's potentially able to slip in subtext of totalitarianism and social commentaries that allow general audience to love it, like I said before, for being a hard R, and also through films like, in a similar way to RoboCop or Starship Troopers, Verhoeven was able to make social statements wrapped around action, sex, and violence, which I feel like people are, especially at this time, were responding to. And so even if it's just the subtext that he's able to leave in there, I think like, he's saying like, this is an action movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger, so most of the people who go to see it are going to take the reality ending. But I am leaving it open-ended enough to where, if somebody wanted to dig into it, there is sort of a, well, is it a dream? Was it?
Right. Well, it's not even just a dream, because it's literally an empowerment fantasy for the character. And if it's all an empowerment fantasy, and we're enjoying this movie as an empowerment fantasy, it is speaking to us in a metafictional way of like, especially white dudes, like, maybe this is all just a fantasy, and we should be aware. Take a moment to think about what this fantasy means for us, and like why we might enjoy this sort of fantasy. What does that say about us?
And what someone else might be suffering because of it.
Sure.
Speaking of just like fantasy things that I absolutely loved of this movie, these are the campiness moments. The one-liners in this movie, pretty legendary.
Consider it a divorce, or whatever he says.
Yeah. Just so many. There's and then the swearing and the insults, the way that it comes about. You said mindfuck earlier, and they said mindfuck in the movie, and I'm wondering if that's the first time. I don't think it is, but what if that's the first time somebody ever said mindfuck?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. What the history of the word mindfuck? Yeah, I don't know.
There's a moment where the elderly woman's walking up to take the suitcase, and he runs up, and then he like snags it from her, and she's like, "You fucking asshole!" and like this old woman's just like going off on him. Just the use of insults and the way that things are said. I don't know. And there's a couple moments where Arnold, it just always feels funny. It's always it always lends itself to that satirical edge.
Yeah, I mean, Arnold he's so good at certain things, and there is like an inherent silliness to him too, though, Mm-hmm. And it's on full display in this movie, and it's one of the things that makes the one-liners kind of work in a weird way, because it kind of leans into the like self-aware, like he had at this point already done this so much in other movies, like of course he's gonna do it here. I don't know. And then like the man, like every time he tries to act out like the sounds of what it is like to fall down a mountain, or to try and strain against a machine, or whatever it is, like the noises that come out of his mouth are so ridiculous and iconic, right? Like you can hear him just struggling and know in an instant that it's Arnold, right?
It's like a yell mixed with a growl.
Yeah. Yeah. It's bizarre. And then also, okay, the one-liners. I gotta mention, I thought they missed an opportunity with the arms, right? Like,
oh yeah,
he says, "I'll see you at the party later," but like,
right.
don't you got to say something like, don't you got to use a pun about arms or something? Like, you know, I really got to hand it to you, Richter, or something. Like, I don't know. Like, I don't know. I was surprised they didn't go there.
Yeah.
It showed like one of the only moments of restraint maybe in the entire movie was not going for the pun.
Can we talk about Arnold and the fact that this potentially, I mean, he does represent, I would say, sort of a peak of a certain type of action movie. I think we've already basically said that. But is he the peak of action? Like, what action movie star do you put up against Arnold Schwarzenegger in sort of that caliber and able to carry anything no matter what in this way, too? It's not necessarily...
You're talking about today or of all time?
Of all time works. Okay. But what I'm trying to say is specifically, like, he balances camp and seriousness like I don't think anyone else can. Because I think there's plenty of amazing, serious action stars. But Arnold has this specific camp about him, that I think it's so unique.
I mean, he's very different, and I think the landscape of film has really changed, and like the position of these sort of action movies has changed. But I look at The Rock as the closest thing we have right now, I think, to that.
Yeah, I think you're right about that.
You know, he's got that physical, you know, stature and the thing that people all want to like look at and like, oh my God, like women want him and men want to be him, right? Like that's the thing, right?
Right.
And then yet he's still got that humor, like, and he can make fun of himself, and he can, you know what I mean? So in that way, I think there's a similarity.
I definitely agree. I think that's a great example. So I did want to circle back to Verhoeven's sort of stance on the dream state of the movie. He does say, regardless of whether people believe the movie as a whole is a dream or reality, according to him, the first 20 minutes or so of the movie, from the beginning up until when he first undergoes the implantation of his recall vacation, that's all reality.
Sure. Well, that makes sense. Yeah, that has to be.
Yeah.
Yeah,
right.
I agree with that.
So it's not like he'd, because I guess technically since he'd already... In some ways of seeing it, you could say like all of it is a dream, basically, or a dream state, or, you know, his world has been flipped upside down because previously he had already been in the machine even before the movie starts.
Oh, no, I don't like that either. I like that, yeah. If you're going to read it as a dream, you have to read everything up to the point of him going to total recall as being reality.
Right.
And I want to, you highlighted on this a little bit, but I want to touch on it again. There are hints at that because of the dream he has about the woman that his wife is jealous of. There is the images on the screen when they're crafting the memory for him. He creates Melina, or whatever that character's name was. He basically creates her, and I think they even show her face on that screen, like the face of the actor. So that is a clear sign. And then they talk about the aliens of Mars and how things have gotten weird, and we're gonna have that in your memory, right? Like they're doing all of these things to hint that maybe it all was crafted.
Yeah, you keep bringing up things that I think are just, this movie's honestly, like with as sort of sparse the actual plot is, it's pretty dense as far as details and everything. The idea of the aliens and, you know, what they've left behind and what sort of stories you could tell from the aliens leaving things on Mars. You know, we've talked a little bit about the underbelly, but the mutant society and sort of how they're able to adapt and like they're able to survive, and yet they're still being oppressed by the lack of oxygen, and this idea that a corporation would hold that over them seems honestly scarily too real.
Yeah, and how they don't care and they're willing to just let them all die.
Yep. The Johnny Cab. Did you love the Johnny Cab?
Yeah, I love the Johnny Cab.
Yeah. Again, sort of prosthetic, animatronic character of some kind, and it's funny and like, you know, makes sense because self-driving cars are
real thing.
A thing now.
Yeah.
So,
but then it's also funny that they would have this animatronic character that you would interact with, right? Like physically. And then also, you know, I love Arnold just ripping him out of the cab, like when he gets frustrated
and driving the little joystick.
But then he also like turns red and gets angry, and then like the car almost kills him. He has to like dodge it, right? Like what was that? Like, it was fun, you know. And this movie, it's this fever dream, right? Like it's. Not only does it feel like the people who were making it were drug fueled, but the movie itself somehow feels drug fueled.
Right.
It's really something. Like the tone of this movie is so unique, and and so quintessentially 80s, just turned up. It's wild.
Right. I would say like quintessentially Verhoeven too. Like it's so much. I don't think there's another voice like him before or after. I think that he was making specific. It's such a tightrope to walk.
Yeah.
He's able to make it, socially conscious while also making it campy and fun, and the action's great.
Well, but I also don't want to say that he never trips on that tightrope, because I think he does sometimes.
No, yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. But I don't think anybody else is sort of able to, his tone, like you were talking about. Nobody is able to strike that tone as I don't know, it's so specifically his voice, I would say.
Well, and that's why I actually really think we should cover the remake as a bonus, because I didn't even realize how, I don't know, iconic this film was. So when they remade it, I don't think I appreciated all the ways in which the movie was in dialogue with the other. And I think at the time I remember reading, and failed to be in dialogue with, failed to be a remake of that movie. Maybe it's trying to be more of a remake of the book or the short story. I don't know. I think it'd be a really interesting one to touch on with our bonus episode this month, if we want to just go ahead and commit and say we're going to do it.
I'm down. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's say we're going to do it. We're going to watch the 2012, I think, remake that, was made, called Total Recall, and we'll discuss it as a bonus episode on our Patreon. So go to Patreon if you want to check that out.
So, we're talking about all these details. I did want to address the fact that this wasn't like a small movie. This movie was had full backing of massive production companies.
It felt like it was a massive production. Yeah.
Right. And that's why the effects are world class. That's why, everything looks really good, and the set design, that's because everything was top of the line. They were going for it. They were making these super risky movies like this. I was reading that Paul Verhoeven signed onto the film in autumn of 1988. Filming began in Mexico City because of its futuristic architecture. 500 people worked on the film. They built 45 sets that tied up 8 sound stages for 6 months. At the time, Total Recall was the second most expensive film in history, next to Rambo 3.
Random? Next to Rambo 3, okay. Yeah. Wow.
So at the time, this is the superhero movies of what we have today, the superhero movies of the 90s and 80s, right?
Well,
it's take these huge action stars, throw them into these massive sci-fi / action adventure crazy scenarios, and just throw everything at the wall. And I think we got some like you said, drug fueled potentially fever dreams that are great to watch. This is a fun watch, warts and all.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And I'm curious, how did this movie do? Because I've always heard that rated R movies are a big risk, right? And people don't make them because, people don't go see them in the theater, so you're not going to recoup that budget. So I'm curious, is this movie an example of it actually being successful, or did it not quite hit expectations?
So as far as I can tell, the budget for the film was $65 million, which, like I said, was one of the most expensive movies at the time. It was in 1990, and domestically, it made $119 million.
There you go. So yeah, this is proof that it can work.
Exactly, which doesn't even go to speak to worldwide, which I think most people know, especially at this time. Schwarzenegger was an international icon. It made $261 million worldwide.
Wow. Yeah. So, that's something I think we're getting some of it, but I still don't feel like there's enough. I want more big budget, Hollywood backed, but adult, serious, whether serious or not, but movies that are being made for adults, right? I want more of that, and I remember in the 90s and in the 80s, there was a willingness to do that I just don't see much nowadays. Everything is more of that PG-13, wide, broadly appealing, nothing that's going to be too upsetting, right?
Right. It's just because it's the potential of more money, right? I think it's the ceiling is higher on a PG-13 movie than an R-rated
Capitalism,
movie.
damn you!
You've bested me again, capitalism, for the last time.
My old enemy.
So, it's not to say that isn't happening. I think that is something that's been, especially since there was a period of time in the 2000s where they were not making adult R-rated films. They were making, and if they were, they were very few and far between, and and I don't know, they were somewhat broadly appealing, or indie films.
Well, I think like the 2000s is where it really started to shift away from that. Feels like to me.
I would say late 2000s is when it started to become like smart R-rated films for like cerebral R-rated films that were like meant to, be thought-provoking and all of this, while also, specifically not being broadly appealing in the way that like a child probably wouldn't.
But not having the budget, having to operate under a smaller budget with smaller expectations.
Right. Yeah, it's true. I mean, I think this 1990 movie is a bad example of like somebody taking that much of a risk, though, because it was still Arnold Schwarzenegger in a giant action movie.
So Arnold, he was guaranteed money at this time. That's true.
So, but yeah, I agree. I think I'm all for it.
Well, and one of the things is I want to when we revisit Total Recall the remake, I think that's going to be something to look at.
I'm sure that was PG-13 too, right?
I'm not sure, but if it was, that on the surface right there is going to tell you something about that movie.
Right.
Anyway, we'll get into that, but I think this is a good place to leave it. This movie is really fascinating. I think it is of a time. I think it is trying to say something about the height of 80s excess, right? Because we're still sort of coming off of that, like where everybody, I think, knew that excess was at its peak, and that like there was something about it that I think rubbed people the wrong way, or they could see it going bad, which I think played out. So it's fascinating to look at this movie as a little time capsule, as it was like projecting forward into the future of like, where are we headed? And where's corporations headed and capitalism headed, right?
Right. And it's crazy to look back and see like how absurdist the biggest movies in the world were at this period of time too. Because it's like, it's not just that they were making a commentary about excess. The movie itself was excess, and it was successful because of that.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to do a little time jump. This is actually tomorrow from when we were recording this. We forgot to record us weighing in on which was better, the short story or the film, and we couldn't let that stand because that's what we're doing this year. We're making the vote, so we decided to jump on here and record our take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was kind of clear in the episode. I think just from context, at least for my answer, it's clear which one I'm going to choose. But I guess we can talk through it a little bit, and maybe I'll feel differently.
Oh, no, I mean, hit me with it, man. It sounds like you're leaning towards the movie.
Yeah, movie. It's the movie for me. I mean, I think as we have to with a lot of these things, we have to definitely all props to the writer, the person who came up with it, Philip K. Dick. Like I said, I think it's a really great skeleton of a story. It's got great sci-fi elements, great just sort of psychological look at memory and how that shapes a human being and all of that. But just, I think, elevated by Paul Verhoeven in the film. I think that, we get some over the top things that were maybe in the story that were like you've said, cranked up to 11, to quote Spinal Tap, or maybe even to 13.
I think I said 13. Yeah.
So we'll crank it up to 13. But yeah, it was, it's an absurd movie, but I think it definitely elevated and fleshed out what was set up in the Philip K. Dick story.
Yeah, I'm riding or dying with Philip K. Dick this time. No, I'm just kidding. I like the movie better. I don't know if I'd say that the movie elevated it, but I do think it took the material and it put a satirical social commentary on it, wrapped up in an Arnold Schwarzenegger 80s action flick that, like, it's tough not to like. And I had a good time watching this thing, and this isn't a story that I hear people talk about when they talk about Philip K. Dick a lot. Like, I personally haven't heard a lot of people reference this one, so I don't even think this is widely considered, one of his best works. So unless you're, outside of the diehard Philip K. Dick enthusiasts, I think it's pretty safe to say that this movie is the more memorable version of the story. They did so much with it that is original. They added so much that it really is one of those adaptations that's very, very loose. So in that sense, all props to Verhoeven and what they were able to achieve. So yeah, for me as well, the film, which it feels like we've been weighing in on the film quite a bit recently. Hopefully that I don't know. I personally hope that changes more. I want to get some more where the book is clearly better, because that'll reinforce my worldview.
Yeah, I mean, I just like to see the variety of them. Sometimes filmmakers take the source material and they swing for the fences and it doesn't work out. But this time, I think Paul Verhoeven was able to make something, like you said, maybe more memorable.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I either way, I'm a fan of, at least we enjoyed it. At least we're not sitting here thinking like, oh, it was awful.
Right. Yeah. It was not perfect. It's not going to be one of my favorite movies. It's not going to make that list, but it was good. I had fun watching it. It is very of its time. And the movie was better. Now we'll let you jump back in time to yesterday to finish out the episode. I don't know if you're ready, man. I think I'm ready to move on and announce our next project. How's that sound?
That sounds good to me.
Okay, so next up we're going to be doing a patron commissioned novel and film. We're going to be doing an episode on the novel, an episode on the film. It is going to be Get Shorty, which I have seen the movie, but I've never read the book. The book is a novel of the same name written by Elmore Leonard, who is a writer I've heard tons about. I know that there's been a lot of adaptations based off of his work, but I've never actually read. So I'm excited to finally, be able to tick that box and say that I've read an Elmore Leonard novel, which we will be doing next week.
Yeah, and I'm excited because I think that I've seen this movie, but honestly, I must have seen it like on HBO or something in passing. Like I barely remember it if I have seen it.
Yeah, I remember enjoying it. It's been a long time, and I said no, it's a Travolta flick. But
right.
Beyond that, so much of it has sort of faded from memory, and I'm really I need to get that Total Recall going.
It's always nice when a patron wants us to do something like this too, because it's like, if this movie is important enough for someone who's a patron to want us to cover it,
to pay us to cover it.
There's got to be something to dig into here. So yeah. I'm excited to, maybe something that I overlooked before. I'm excited to dig into and get good perspective on.
Next week, we will be doing our episode on the book, which if you have seen the movie and you're curious what the book's like, definitely check out that episode. We'll talk about it in a non-spoiler way early on, let you know, and maybe you get a feel for whether or not it's a book you do want to go check out, or if you just want to hear us talk about it, and then we'll get into the film. Hopefully you stick with us, and we're back on track now. We're going to be continuing to release our weekly episodes. Black Lives Matter, and we still oppose the police brutality that is fucking outrageous right now, and I continue to see videos after videos that is mind-boggling. But anyway,
we spoke before the episode about how sometimes it doesn't feel right doing some of this stuff, but we feel like some people are looking for escape, and we like to analyze movies and books, and that's sort of what we do. So we're going to continue to support them and continue to keep on doing what we do. Well,
and like we talked about, it's important stuff, and it affects culture. Culture affects art. Art affects culture. It's a product of culture. So we'll continue to look at it with that lens, as in addition to the creative lens. So hopefully you enjoy that. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please leave us a rating and review on whatever podcast app you use. Let us know that you enjoyed this episode. And I will grab a screenshot of your review, and I'll post it on social media. I've been doing that a lot, if it was positive. Even if it's not positive. Well, even if it's not, sometimes we got a 1-star recently that I shared around. So, we encourage you to do that. It also helps us to get the word out. It's fun. We appreciate you taking the time to give us that sort of feedback. Absolutely.
And make sure you connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at Ink2Film. Make sure you join the Council of Inklings on Facebook as well. It's a Facebook group. We post polls, we post adaptation news, anything we see that sort of pertains to the podcast as a whole, anything we find interesting or potential projects that might be coming up. This project itself was a poll that we put up on our Council of Inklings, and the majority spoke and said Total Recall, so we covered it.
Yeah, we had it up against a couple of other sort of 80s/90s just out there movies, and this is the one that won, but we also had The Fly, we had Johnny Mnemonic. What was the other one we had on there?
I think Maximum Overdrive was on there as well.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, the Stephen King way over the top movie that he directed, which I still want to cover at some point one day because it's the Stephen King directorial debut, so I think it's notable for that reason, right? Yeah,
It's legendary. It's like a full-on Coke binge film.
yeah. So if you want to hear us cover something like that, definitely let us know and join the council so you can vote. Also, we are on Goodreads. I want to shout that out a little bit because we've had some people commenting on some forums and having some discussion. We encourage you to go there and talk with us, talk with each other about these adaptations, and I think that's a pretty good platform for it. So if you're on Goodreads, search for Ink to Film Book Club, and you can join that.
Thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, that's going to be it for this week. Like we said, we'll be back with Get Shorty. Hopefully you'll join us for that. And until next time.
Thanks for listening.